Hi, my name is Anna Huebner. Welcome to Crash Course U.S. History. Today we talk about slavery. Yes, that is a lay on the globe to make it a little more cheerful, because let's face it, slavery is depressing. Wasn't slavery started in the 19th century? Oh, me from the past. It's embarrassing how little history I knew before taking APUSH history with Mr. Caesar. Slavery was actually introduced to the colonies in the 17th century. It wasn't the first kind of labor available in the colonies either. Indentured servitude was very popular before 1675, accounting for 75% of English immigrants to Virginia and Maryland in the 17th century. However, Bacon's rebellion helped change the labor force to slavery.
No, not that kind of Bacon. Bacon's rebellion is named for Nathaniel Bacon, who led Virginian farmers in a rebellion against governing powers. Having asked for protection against their aggressive Indian neighbors and being ignored, the farmers, many of whom were previously indentured servants, rebelled. These plantation-owning families came to realize that unemployed former indentured servants were a threat to social stability. They turned increasingly to the use of slaves, who regarded it as a safer source of labor. The cultivation of tobacco, introduced by John Rolfe, required a lot of this inexpensive labor, and slavery fulfilled just that.
Slavery was legally established in all 13 colonies by the early 1700s. Factors responsible for this development of slavery included an insufficient supply of indentured servants, demand for workers due to tobacco cultivation, and the fact that it wasn't considered immoral at the time by the colonists. The slaves, however, had a different idea.
One of the earliest acts of rebellion against slavery was the Stonewall Rebellion. Organized and led by slaves living south of Charleston, South Carolina, they tried unsuccessfully to flee to Spanish Florida to gain their freedom.
While the Declaration of Independence called for freedom from the throne, it did not call for freedom from slavery.
The first national document actually containing a prohibition of slavery was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, excluding slavery north of the Ohio River in the Northwest Territories.
Also written in 1787, the Constitution actually guaranteed the legality of slavery through the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise was a compromise between the northern states and the southern states that counted every slave as 3/5 of a person for the distribution of taxes and the apportionment of members of the House of Representatives. The 14th Amendment later invalidated this compromise, saying that
representatives shall be apportioned, counting the whole number of persons in each state. There is a free African American population growing through individual states' gradual emancipation laws, freedom for serving in the Revolutionary War, freedom given by masters, and a natural increase among free African Americans.
Slavery was actually on the decline until the invention of the cotton gin.
Invented by Eli Whitney, the cotton gin made it possible and profitable to harvest cotton, which is previously a labor-consuming task. Cotton became the South's most important cash crop, being nicknamed King Cotton because of the cotton gin, the rich farmland in the deep South that allowed cultivation of cotton, and the rise of textile manufacturing in England that created a large demand for cotton.
This guy was responsible for a lot of slavery.
Manifest destiny, or the belief that the United States would inevitably expand westward to the Pacific Ocean, also had a big impact on slavery.
The Missouri Compromise of 1820, created because of manifest destiny, was a compromise between free and slave states, just like the Three-Fifths Compromise.
It stated that Maine would enter the Union as a free state, while Missouri would enter as a slave state. The remaining territory of the Louisiana Purchase above latitude 3630 would be closed to slavery. Similarly, the Compromise of 1850 admitted California to the Union as a free state, abolished slave trade, but not slavery, in the District of Columbia, and created territorial governments in New Mexico and Utah under popular sovereignty. For the slave states, the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted, helping return runaway slaves to their owners.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 proposed dividing the territory of Nebraska into two territories. Provisions in the act included the following. The proposed territory of Nebraska would be divided into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. The status of slavery would be settled by popular sovereignty, which meant that the settlers in a given territory would have the sole right to decide whether or not slavery would be permitted. Senator Stephen A. Douglas illustrates this concept by saying,
"The great principle is the right of every community to judge and decide for itself whether a thing is right or wrong. It is no answer to this argument to say that slavery is an evil, and hence should not be tolerated. You must allow the people to decide for themselves whether it is a good or an evil."
The Kansas-Nebraska Act was controversial. repealing the Missouri Compromise and creating a divisive debate over the expansion of slavery into the territories. It led to the demise of the Whigs, the split of the Democratic Party, and the rise of the Republican Party. Kansas also became known as Bloody Kansas. So, slavery had a big impact in territorial expansion only, right? No, slavery also had a huge social and political influence too. In the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that black people were not citizens of the United States and therefore could not petition the court. Dred Scott was a slave and could not, therefore, sue in federal court. The Dred Scott decision established a principle that national legislation could not limit the spread of slavery into the territories. By stating that Congress had no right to prohibit slavery in the territories, the Dred Scott decision repealed the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and the Missouri Compromise of 1820.
The Second Great Awakening contributed to the growth of the abolitionist movement. Some well-known abolitionists were William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of The Liberator, who issued the first call for the immediate and uncompensated emancipation of the slaves. Frederick Douglass, who was the most prominent black abolitionist during the antebellum period, exposing Americans to the horrors and inhumanity of slavery in its 1845 autobiography, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, intensifying Northern opposition to slavery through stories of what slaves underwent. Only the Bible sold more copies.
Now it's time for the mystery document. In this game, I have to try to guess the author of the mystery document, and if I get it wrong, I get shocked. So let's go.
I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On the subject, I do not wish to think, or speak, or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hand of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard. The apathy of the people is enough to make every statue leap from its pedestal and to hasten the resurrection of the dead.
Is it William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of The Liberator?
Yep.
Yes. William Lloyd Garrison is an abolitionist, and so it makes perfect sense that he would be defending his view, even though he knows that it's controversial.
Second, we come to the Civil War, and now we will discuss some causes for the Civil War. First, the South went to the war to fight for states' rights. It wasn't originally about slavery, it was states' rights. And South Carolina led a secession in December of 1860, immediately after Lincoln was elected president, as a Republican president, and they didn't like that. So then the North went to the war to preserve the Union. The North was not about slavery until Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863.
Some advantages for the North is that they had an extensive railroad network, a strong industrial base, a superior navy, a larger population, and an abundant supply of food.
The North had some disadvantages to the war as well. First, there was a shortage of experienced and skilled military commanders, as well as a divided population that did not fully support the war.
Some advantages for the South is that they had a defensive war fought on its home territory, a long coastline that would be difficult to blockade, an important cash crop in cotton, a group of experienced and skilled military commanders, and a close economic relationship with Great Britain.
The South also had some disadvantages in the war. First, they had a smaller population in the North, and second, they had a smaller industrial base in the North. There were also what is known as border states during the Civil War, which are states that remained loyal to the Union but still had slaves in them. So some key border states, the Union had to make sure that they didn't convert to the South to favor slavery and eventually succeed in Kentucky and Maryland. And that is why Lincoln waited to issue the proclamation.
In the Battle of Antietam, the Union victory persuaded England and France to remain neutral. While both European powers saw advantages in a divided America, they followed a cautious policy toward both the North and the South. The Union victory enabled Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Next we had the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg in the southern Pennsylvania was the turning point of the war. The southern offensive was stopped, and this marked the last time that the South invaded Northern Territory. And then another key battle was the Battle of Vicksburg, which was a key port town in the Mississippi River. Its Union capture split the Confederacy, isolating Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the Confederacy. It also gave the Union control of the Mississippi River. And then we had Sherman's March to the Sea, where Sherman marched from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, to split the Confederacy a second time. Sherman used total war tactics, destroying everything from military supplies to innocent villages and civilians. And finally, after all this splitting of the Confederacy, Lee surrendered at the battle. Well, it wasn't a battle, really, but it was a courthouse in Appomattox, where Lee surrendered in April 1865.
Next we come to the Emancipation Proclamation, and President Lincoln refrained from taking action to emancipate slaves until the Civil War had been in progress for almost 2 years. Lincoln delayed because he wanted to retain the loyalty of the border states. The Union victory at Antietam gave Lincoln the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which only freed slaves in the rebellious states and did not free slaves in the border states, so as to maintain that loyalty to the Union that the border states originally had, because he didn't want them to succeed. And then the immediate effect of the Emancipation Proclamation was to strengthen the moral cause of the Union. The North was now not only fighting to preserve the Union, but also to end slavery. So it changed the moral of the war. And the Emancipation Proclamation was much stronger on proclamation than on emancipation, because it did not actually end up freeing a single slave. Slavery was legally abolished by the 13th Amendment. The main purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation was to build moral cause for the North.
The Reconstruction Amendments were a series of 3 amendments. First, the 13th Amendment in 1865 abolished slavery and involuntary servitude and also completed the work of the Emancipation Proclamation. The 14th Amendment in 1868 made the former slaves citizens, thus invalidating the Dred Scott decision, and provided for the equal protection of the laws for all citizens, stating, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws," and it enforced congressional legislation guaranteeing civil rights to former slaves. The 15th Amendment in 1870 provided suffrage for black males.
Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was set up in March 1863 in an effort to supply freed blacks with job skills and a basic education, and it served as kind of an early program for welfare, as it also provided food for those blacks. And then there was the system called the Radical Reconstruction, when former Confederates were elected to Congress, black codes were enacted in southern states, and race riots broke out in New Orleans and Memphis. There were attempts in the South to undermine the 14th Amendment, and under some programs and policies during the Radical Reconstruction, some military occupation of the South was permitted, punishment of Confederate leaders became policy, and restrictions were placed on the power of President Andrew Johnson. Also, the House of Representatives impeached Johnson because they claimed that he ceased to enforce the Reconstruction Act.
Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction involved a nation only unified with no animosity. Pardons were given to people who swear loyalty, and states would be readmitted once at least 10% of the population swears loyalty oaths. States had to form new constitutions that outlawed slavery.
The Radical Republicans' plan included the idea that most representatives in Congress were radicals who felt that Lincoln's plan was too lenient. So they passed the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. And they also said that 50% of the state's voters had to swear loyalty to the Union for the state to be readmitted. 50%, that's a lot of voters. And only non-Confederates were allowed to vote and hold political office. Lincoln refused to sign the Wade-Davis Bill, saying that it was too harsh to the South.
Next we had Andrew Johnson's plan, and it also involved a 10% clause similar to Lincoln's, and it required an abolition of slavery clause in state constitutions also similar to Lincoln's, and it also said that states must ratify the 13th Amendment to be readmitted into the Union. It forgave Confederate states of war debts, and it took political rights away, or disenfranchised, from former Confederate leaders and owners of more than $20,000 in taxable property.
Now you may be curious about how African Americans fared during Reconstruction. Slaves became sharecroppers. There was a Supreme Court case in 1896, when it was called Plessy v. Ferguson, and it upheld segregation by approving the separate but equal accommodations for African Americans. It led to the establishment of separate school systems for African Americans, which was reversed in 1954 with a landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. And also part of the Jim Crow laws of the South was disenfranchising black voters. Literacy tests and poll taxes were used to deny African Americans the ballot. The grandfather clause exempted from these requirements anyone whose forebear had voted in 1860. Needless to say, black slaves had not voted at that time. Electoral districts were also gerrymandered to favor the Democratic Party.